The blade rose with the morning sun over Bamberg. On May 1st, 1573, a 19-year-old man named Frantz Schmidt stepped into the city square, not as a spectator, but as the executioner. Before him knelt a condemned thief, bound and trembling. As Schmidt raised the sword for the first time, the weight of his family's fate, the law of the empire, and centuries of stigma pressed down on his shoulders. With a single stroke, he began a career that would end 394 lives. Frantz Schmidt was not born a butcher, but a legacy. His father, Heinrich Schmidt, had once been a simple woodsman until the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach conscripted him into the role of executioner, a command impossible to refuse. From that moment, the Schmidt name became a mark of social exile. Executioners in the Holy Roman Empire were necessary but untouchable, tolerated by rulers, shunned by neighbors. Their children were often barred from guilds, churches, and respectable professions. And so Frantz, born into dishonor, chose not to escape the name, but to redeem it. He trained under his father's hand in the town of Hof, learning the techniques of strangulation, sword beheading, and public humiliation punishments. But it was in Bamberg, a rising administrative center of Franconia, where Schmidt would make his first public kill. That day is immortalized in his meticulous execution diary. On May 1st, 1573, I wielded the sword for the first time in Bamberg. This entry was not just the cold recollection of a task, it was the moment a youth inherited an empire's justice. His act was neither rogue nor cruel. Bamberg's city council, like many in the empire, formally contracted executioners, recording their payments in ledgers like any other civil servant. One note dryly affirms, "The executioner, Frantz Schmidt, is paid for the sentence carried out." Behind this bureaucratic line was a young man who had just killed in the name of the law, under the eyes of the people who both needed and despised him. Yet Schmidt's gaze was never fixed only on the scaffold. He sought something nearly no executioner dared to dream: legitimacy. Over the next 2 decades, he would become one of the most sought-after professionals in the empire. Schmidt had not only mastered the art of execution, he had transformed it into an institution. His rise was not just personal. It was a chilling testament to how, in the Holy Roman Empire, justice could elevate even the outcast, if he wielded the blade with enough precision. The ritual of justice, public executions carried out by Frantz Schmidt. The crowd pressed in around the scaffold in Nuremberg's Hauptmarkt, children perched on barrels, merchants clutching their aprons. At the platform's center stood a man dressed in dark official garb, calm and motionless. Before him, a condemned murderer knelt beside a block. Then, a single, flawless stroke. Frantz Schmidt had done his work again. From 1573 to 1617, Frantz Schmidt executed 394 people across the Holy Roman Empire. But his career was not merely a parade of deaths. Each execution was a ritual of justice, shaped by imperial law, local custom, and deeply entrenched symbolism. To the city councils that employed him, Schmidt was not a figure of terror. He was a civil servant, a living instrument of law. The sword was his signature. In an entry dated July 15, 1589, Schmidt recorded the beheading of Andreas Rascher, a convicted murderer. "I beheaded Andreas Rascher with the sword. He had murdered a man on the road to Würzburg. The execution, carried out in public, was swift and precise. Sword beheading was considered the most honorable form of death, typically reserved for male criminals of higher social standing. The blade, unlike the rope or wheel, allowed the condemned to meet death with dignity, but it also demanded perfection. A failed stroke meant agony and humiliation. Schmidt, by all accounts, never failed. Other methods were far from dignified. On April 3, 1587, Schmidt executed a serial killer. The breaking wheel, one of the most feared punishments in Europe, was designed not merely to kill, but to degrade and prolong pain. Arms and legs were shattered one by one with an iron club, often while the victim was conscious. Schmidt's entry is brief, clinical, but the horror of the scene is unmistakable. Such executions were reserved for the worst offenders: murderers, traitors, and blasphemers. Punishment was deeply gendered. Schmidt recorded the execution of a woman found guilty of infanticide. She was sewn into a sack and thrown into the water as the law prescribes. This was saxtos, death by drowning in a sewn sack, sometimes with a dog or rooster placed inside. It was an ancient Germanic punishment, specifically prescribed for mothers who killed their infants. Though not always public, such executions were witnessed by officials and sometimes by the townspeople themselves. They were symbolic acts, the waters cleansing society of a moral offence too disturbing to bear. Even burning alive was not beyond his duties. Fire was reserved for those crimes deemed not only lethal, but morally corrosive: poison, heresy, and sorcery. The spectacle was slow and devastating, with the crowd often surrounding the stake in silent witness. The point was not just death, but public purgation. There was no sadism in his actions, no revelry in death. The solemnity of the moment, the careful control, it was part of a larger system. His duty was not cruelty, but order. His blade did not waver because the state could not afford uncertainty. In a society where crime was met with ceremony, the executioner stood not on the fringe, but at the center of law. Frantz Schmidt's executions were not medieval chaos, they were statecraft. A man's limbs shattered on the wheel was a message. A sword stroke that fell clean was reassurance. In a world where justice wore a public face, Schmidt was its execution. From blood to honor, the unlikely legacy of the executioner. The stone at St. Rochus Cemetery bears no shame, no symbol of death, no whisper of disgrace. Instead, it honors a man once feared, now revered. Frantz Schmidt, vengeance's hand, healer's heart, honored in death as in life. For nearly half a century, he ended lives beneath the public eye. Yet in the final years of his own, he began to save them. Frantz Schmidt's legacy is unlike any in medieval criminal history. Born into hereditary dishonor, his trade was one of social exile. The executioner was a necessary evil, employed by city councils, protected by law, but despised by nearly everyone. His children were shunned. His hands, though clean in the eyes of the empire, were ritually unclean in the eyes of his neighbors. In the year 1617, after executing his 394th condemned soul, he put down the sword. He did not retire into silence. Instead, he announced a new calling: healing. Using knowledge of anatomy gained from decades of dissection, Schmidt began to treat wounds, set bones, and dispense herbal remedies. Where once people watched him with dread, they now came to his door in hope. In his own diary, he quietly recorded the shift. "I ceased serving at the block and began attending to the ill." This transformation would not go unnoticed. In 1624, Emperor Ferdinand II issued an extraordinary decree. For the first time in imperial memory, an executioner was declared ehrlich, honorable. The decree explicitly lifted the stain of Schmidt's profession, making him legally and socially equal to those who had once cast him out. Frantz Schmidt had executed the empire's justice with relentless precision. Now the empire returned the favor with its highest honor. He died in 1634, not as a pariah, but as a respected citizen of Nuremberg. His grave bears witness to a paradox the medieval world rarely allowed: that a man of blood could leave behind not horror, but honor. His story forces us to ask, can a life bound to blood ever end in honor? Comment below, do you believe justice, when served by the hand of an outcast, can ever be truly accepted by society? from his official pardon by Emperor Ferdinand II, 1624, declared Ehrlich no longer stained by his office and thus restored to honourable standing.